Welcome to another edition of 7 and 7, where we will cover this week's Torah portion of 7 readings in about 7 minutes and 7 lessons. This week's Torah portion is Parshat Teitzei, which is a Torah portion that is unique in the fact that it has the single most mitzvot in the entire Torah, about 74 of them. So we won't have time to go through all of them, but we certainly will try to go through many of them. The Torah starts off with the laws of war, and what happens if a male soldier finds a female in captivity that he finds attractive, and how he can go about marrying her in a proper way. The Torah also talks about the laws of a firstborn child, what his rights are with regards to inheritance. And finally, the Torah tells us the laws of a child who's rebellious to an extreme, and how the parents could take him to the court and what they should do with him. The Baal Shem Tov points out that the phrase Ki Teitzei la milchama, the first phrase of the Torah portion that says when you go out to war and capture a captive, refers to a spiritual and emotional wars as well. And that is that anytime we have challenges, we're instructed not just to win, but also to bring back a captive. And that means that not just to fight back, but also to take something, to learn something from it, and possibly even convert that challenge into a greater lesson, into a greater meaning that you can take to your life moving forward. The second Torah portion has a whole bunch of other mitzvahs. Talks about the proper burial of the dead and how we have to do that as fast as possible, how to help a neighbor or a fellow Jew whose animals are struggling and they're falling down and they can't carry their load, the prohibition against taking the eggs from the mother chicken before sending the mother chicken away. The Hasidic interpretation on the mitzvah of helping the donkey that's fallen is that sometimes a person themselves falls spiritually to the level of a donkey. The Torah's exact words are, we can't ignore it. And so anytime you encounter a Jew, a friend of yours, or really anybody that you see has fallen, is struggling, we're instructed to pick them up, and we cannot ignore that. And for the very fact that we've encountered that, we've seen their struggle, that in itself is a proof that we're instructed not just to engage and to help, but also to be successful in that endeavor. The third reading has some more mitzvahs, the mitzvah of building a fence around the new home, the mitzvah against certain mixtures of seeds, of animals, certain types of clothing, the mitzvah of wearing tzitzit, the penalty for a husband who defames his wife, what happens to somebody who commits adultery or rape, and the Torah lists certain prohibited marriages. The first phrase of this reading says, Ki tivneh bayit chadash, when you will build a new home, you should put up a fence. Perhaps spiritually, the idea here is that anytime we try to build a home for God, we try to venture out into the big wide world and we want to make it a place of spirituality, we need to put up a fence. What that means is we have to really have our principles lined up. What are the red lines for us? What are the things that we don't cross over? What are the things we really stand for? And that's really the key to success. The only way to really truly change this world without being changed yourself for the bad is to really have certain principles and guidelines that you stand for. The fourth reading has some more mitzvahs, more laws that relate to going out to war, how to keep a clean camp. There's prohibitions against prostitution, prohibitions against doing business that involves interest, the mitzvah to honor our word, and many more mitzvahs. And the Torah also says you should not despise the Egyptian, even though we cannot marry an Egyptian until the third generation, but we're not allowed to despise them because the Torah says we used to live in their land. And even though that seems a little bit paradoxical, because we should despise them for having lived in their land, after all, they treated us horribly. But perhaps the message of the Torah here is that if you really want to leave their land, you really want to be a free people and have no longer any association with them, you really need to not despise them. You have to let go of hate if you really want to be a free people. The fifth reading tells us the laws of employees who are working in a field and their right to partake in the food that they're working on. The Torah discusses the laws of marriage and divorce, and the Torah says that a couple that's been divorced cannot get remarried to each other if the wife was married to somebody else in between. Why is it that the Torah allows divorce? Of course, the Torah is very pro-marriage, and the Torah encourages it strongly. Why is it that the Torah allows divorce? And perhaps this really goes to a profound idea in Judaism, and that is that God knows that although He gives us all the support and encouragement and instructions that we need, it's inevitable that we'll mess up sometimes, and so God has a system and a plan for us what to do in case something goes wrong. So rather than give up and realize that and think that the struggle is too big and it's impossible for us to fulfill God's commandments, realize to the contrary that the mitzvah of divorce exists. There's sometimes a time where we need to say, you know what, this is not right, let's stop it and start again. But realize that God is also there holding your hand the second time around and instructing you how to do it exactly from a Torah perspective. The sixth reading tells us some more laws relating to war, and that is that a newlywed man is forbidden to go out to war. If somebody takes a collateral from a friend of his for a loan, he cannot take utensils that are used for preparing food, and he cannot take the clothes or the blankets of a poor person as collateral overnight. He can only take it during the daytime when the person doesn't need it. The Torah tells us the prohibition against kidnapping, and the Torah puts in that we're always instructed to remember what happened to Miriam, Moses and Aaron's sister, when she spoke Lashon Hara, when she spoke the evil word, and she received leprosy as a punishment. It's an interesting concept to consider the fact that Miriam was so harshly punished. And really, if you look at what she said, her words were true. And there was not a lot of criticism there either, certainly not in the literal reading of her words. And so the commentaries discuss why is it that Miriam was so severely punished. But perhaps there's a lesson here that even when we talk about other people, even if what we're saying is true and it's not negative, we need to be so careful anytime we talk about anybody else, because it's bound to lead to some negativity, and so therefore it's always best not to talk about somebody else at all. The seventh and final reading tells us that we're forbidden to withhold payment of an employee. We have to pay it on time. Certain testimonies are not admissible in a court of law. The Torah tells us some agricultural laws that relate to the poor. If certain sections of the field were forgotten, or if somebody dropped a bundle, they cannot go back for it and they have to allow the poor to come pick it up. And the Torah talks about a fascinating case of marriage where a man dies childless, and he has a younger brother. And so the Torah says that the brother should be instructed to marry the widow of the deceased brother, unless one of them doesn't want to, in which case there's a process of that rejection. The Torah also tells us to be careful with weights and measures when we do business. And finally, the Torah tells us to remember what Amalek did to us on our way out of Egypt. Rashi points out in the name of the Midrash that it turns out that somebody who drops a bundle of wheat has to leave it for the poor. So it turns out that somebody who did a mitzvah by mistake, he forgot it, he dropped it without even realizing, still it's considered the mitzvah of tzedakah, it's considered the mitzvah of charity. And I think there's a powerful lesson here that we sometimes ask ourselves, what's the value of a mitzvah if I don't fully appreciate it? What's the value of a mitzvah if I don't understand it? But here Rashi is pointing out that even if you're not even aware of the fact that you did it, that is also a mitzvah. And so certainly we should try to accumulate as many mitzvahs as we can. Wishing you a wonderful week and a Shabbat Shalom.